When people talk about emo, pop punk, and punk rock, it seems like they always talk about the early 2000s. And I guess that does make sense because the early 2000s were the height of emo, pop punk, and punk rock's mainstream popularity in pop culture. But what happened after that? What happened after rock faded away from the mainstream? Well, emo and pop punk and punk rock went back to the underground, and we got the 2010s emo and pop punk revival. There's going to be a lot of nostalgia in this video for me. There's really no way of getting around that. I was in high school and college during the 2010s, so the songs and bands that I'm going to talk about shaped my music fandom. They shaped me. All these songs and bands were the soundtrack to my youth. The first thing we have to do is talk about how we got here. What happened before the 2010s? Or, I guess we could call this part the story so far. So why do people call the 2010s a revival in the first place? The reason is because after the height of emo, pop punk, and punk rock's mainstream popularity in the early 2000s, rock music faded away from the mainstream. Many of the popular bands from the 2000s either broke up or they just stopped making music that sounded like emo or pop punk. It's hard to narrow it down to an exact moment when rock music stopped being mainstream, but I think I'm going to go with My Chemical Romance's The Black Parade in 2006.
You what?
I'm not saying that there wasn't great emo or pop punk after 2006 and before 2010, relax. I'm just saying that when people talk about the nostalgic 2000s emo and pop punk scene, most of the time, the oldest album that they talk about is The Black Parade. It was the last gasp of the 2000s emo boom period, and then, sometime after that, the bubble burst. Between 2006 and 2010, you had a few emo bands still in the mainstream, a Paramore obviously being the biggest example, a Panic at the Disco, Fall Out Boy, but it was Fale Adu Fall Out Boy, which is just a rock album, and it's a pretty good one. I don't understand why fans had, there was such a backlash for that album. It's a pretty good rock album. But no one can argue that emo wasn't fading away from the mainstream. I mean, all three of those bands that I just mentioned would probably say that none of those albums that were released during that time were emo or pop punk anyway. Oddly enough, the story of the 2010s revival starts in 2006. I know. Trust me, it all makes sense. In 2006, we got Mutiny by Set Your Goals, one of the most important Easycore albums of all time. If you don't know what Easycore is, don't worry, it's basically pop punk with breakdowns, and most of the time there was some screaming as well. Easycore has always been like the weird uncle to emo and pop punk, but it is a major factor in the 2010s emo revival because all of those Easycore bands were active and touring with all the bands that were popular in the 2010s. In 2007, we got All Time Low's So Wrong It's Right, which really is one of the only albums from a new band to get really popular in that time period before the 2010s. Back to Easycore, in 2007 we got Rise or Die Trying from 4 Year Strong, and in 2009 we got Homesick from A Day to Remember. Both were very popular albums, Homesick a little bit more, but both bands were instantly solidified as fan favorites, and both bands, as well as Set Your Goals, would be major bands in the 2010s. I'm mentioning all of these Easycore bands because a lot of the things Easycore was known for, breakdowns, screaming, songs about friends, songs about pizza, songs about hating your hometown, all of that also made its way into the 2010 revival, so I wanted to at least explain where all of that started. Also, a band that never gets credit for helping start Easycore is Daggermouth. In my opinion, the album that officially started the 2010s emo and pop punk revival was The Upsides by The Wonder Years. I mean, the album was released on January 26th, 2010. It's literally released right at the start of the decade. So now that we have our start date, I'm going to talk about the important bands in the scene at the time. The bands that were the most popular, the bands that made the most impact. And I'm also going to talk about the different factors that made the 2010s revival such a different and unique time in the scene. As I said earlier, the Wonder Years started the entire 2010s pop-punk revival. If Nevermind by Nirvana killed hair metal, then the Upsides and the Wonder Years killed all the pop-punk boy bands of the 2000s. Because I know someone is going to bring it up, yes, the Wonder Years do technically have an album before the Upsides get stoked on it, but that album really has more to do with Easycore than pop punk, but some of those songs on Get Stoked on It are the first Wonder Years songs I ever heard, so it does kind of hold a special place in my heart. And honestly, the Won't Be Pathetic Forever EP should be remembered a lot more because it's way more important than Get Stoked on It. Just as much as some other slogans from other bands that we're going to get into, I'm Not Sad Anymore was everywhere. It was all over Tumblr, it was all over message boards, Facebook groups, all over the band's merch. It was everywhere. The Upsides and the follow-up Suburbia, I've Given You All, and Now I'm Nothing, and The Greatest Generation are not just some of the best albums from the 2010s, but they're some of the best pop-punk albums of all time. The Wonder Years perfected the honest storytelling lyrical style that many other bands would eventually use. The Wonder Years songs weren't generic and broad to appeal to a mass audience. The band referenced specific places, specific people, and it almost kind of created a Wonder Years cinematic universe. The Wonder Years are also one of the few bands from that scene that I think have aged incredibly well. The Wonder Years grew up with their audience, and with every album talked about the topics and the issues that their fans were dealing with as they got older. The Wonder Years went from singing about girls and parties to singing about the struggle to remain positive for your children while the world gets crazier around you day after day. The pop-punk revival doesn't happen without the Wonder Years. So many bands tried to copy them after the Upsides and none of them lasted because the Wonder Years were just better. After the Wonder Years, I don't think there's any band more synonymous with the 2010s pop-punk revival than Man Overboard. And I think we all know why. Defend pop-punk. While it might seem cringy now, let me tell you, as someone who was there, the Defend pop-punk logo was everywhere. And almost more than the music, Man Overboard is remembered for giving us that slogan. If anyone in Man Overboard sees this, I need to know how much money was made from the Defend Pop Punk merch. It had to be so much. That hoodie was everywhere in the early 2010s, and I guarantee a lot of you watching this video right now are wondering if you still have it in storage somewhere. Besides defending pop punk, Man Overboard was very popular, and while it might be obvious based on the band's name, I always thought Man Overboard was the most Blink-182 Newfound Glory style of pop punk of any of the bands from the 2010s. If there was some mainstream outlet like MTV in the 2010s, I think Man Overboard would have been a mainstream band. I'll never forget when the band released their self-titled in 2011, and someone was like, Man Overboard doesn't just sing about girls anymore, they also sing about life. I remember reading that comment, and it was as if some new discovery Man Overboard had made for the pop-punk world. We can sing about other things besides girls. You can't talk about the pop-punk revival of the 2010s without talking about the story so far. I remember the day Quicksand came out, and it blew my mind. I was at the first Chicago show after Under Soil and Dirt came out, and being in that crowd for the moment in the song, screaming those words, I'm trying real hard not to lose my temper, pointing my finger furiously back at the band, you just had to be there. The Story So Far were one of the few pop-punk bands that really let their hardcore influences shine. Most of the Story So Far songs are pop-punk songs, sure, but this isn't pop-punk like The Starting Line. This is pop-punk infused with hardcore. I think the band's self-titled is really the perfect example of that. The Story So Far were also one of the few bands that had a frontman, Parker Cannon, who had a stage presence, star power, charisma, whatever you want to call it. I'd throw Suppy from the Wonder Years in there as well, but even today in 2024, people have a strong opinion on Parker Cannon. I don't know if it's a controversial take, but I like The Story So Far's new music. They're more of a rock band now, but after you define what pop punk sounds like with 2 or 3 of your albums, I think you're supposed to grow. You realize that you want a conversation. Modern Baseball being labeled pop punk was always weird to me. They are way more of a 2000s indie emo type of a band more than pop punk, but regardless, Modern Baseball's impact on the pop punk and emo scene was massive. They were the first band, at least that I know of, that had emo songs that described being a teenager in the 2010s through the lens of social media. The band had lyrics that included Facebook and Twitter, which might not seem like a big deal to you now, but I think it's a big reason why people still love Modern Baseball and why they want them to reunite so bad. Talking about social media in their songs made it easy for an audience to connect with them because the band was singing about trying to interpret vague Facebook statuses from your crush or talking to your crush on Twitter. It's easy to connect with a band when they're singing about something that you're going through, and the closer the situations are, the closer the connection is between a fan and the band. There's also something special about going to a show and seeing someone your age or close to your age singing about the same problems that you're going through. Mobo also didn't really sound like any of the other bands in the scene. They had a awkward indie vibe to them that made them unique. And out of all the bands I talk about in this video, Modern Baseball is the one that fans want to reunite the most. Well, actually, there is one other band. Oh yeah, it's time to talk about Title Fight, the band that introduced an entire generation of kids to hardcore and shoegaze. Title Fight was the cool band. If you didn't want to defend pop punk, eat pizza, and hang out with your friends, you listened to Title Fight. Title Fight did a pretty rare thing where you could argue that their early songs, like Neck Deep for example, that was a pop punk song. Then Shed was more of a hardcore album, then the band went full shoegaze with Hyperview. It doesn't matter which era of Title Fight that you liked, Title Fight are one of the most beloved bands from the 2010s, and a band that people really want to see reunite. Speaking of Neck Deep, let's talk about Neck Deep. Neck Deep, easily one of the most popular bands of the 2010s, and Neck Deep is one of the biggest pop punk bands in the world today. In the early days, Neck Deep was a little bit more aggressive than the other pop punk bands at the time. A lot of people compared them to The Story So Far, but the song that changed everything was A Part of Me. If you weren't there, I can't do it justice, just how quickly this song took over the scene. It was instantly a fan favorite, it was instantly the song every guy listened to when they were thinking about their crush. Neck Deep followed that up by, just releasing one of the best pop punk albums of all time with Life's Not Out to Get You. I was at the first Chicago Neck Deep show and it was insane. Everyone knew every word. It was one of the best shows I've ever been to. And like I said, Neck Deep is still going strong, and next year just happens to be the 10-year anniversary of Life's Not Out to Get You. Just saying. After Overboard, State Champs were the quintessential pop-punk band, another band that I think would have fit right in with the early 2000s pop-punk scene. Elevated is one of the best pop-punk songs ever, and State Champs are still putting out quality pop-punk. I was lucky enough to see State Champs play some small venues here in Chicago, and I'm talking old school. I'm talking old Shades of Grey era State Champs. Right up there with Defend Pop Punk and I'm Not Sad Anymore, we can't forget Sleepy Eyes and Bony Knees from Real Friends. Real Friends, of course, are from the Chicago suburbs, so I got to see them on their entire rise, and I remember when their first EP, This Is Honesty, came out, and it was it was this little EP that only a few kids talked about online. But the Everyone That Dragged You Here EP is the one that took over the scene, and then everyone had Sleepy Eyes and Bony Knees. And I want to say, if you're not listening to the new songs from Real Friends, I think you're missing out because I think their new stuff is some of the best music they have ever put out. Speaking of Chicago and speaking of Real Friends, I think there's one other band from the Chicago pop punk scene that we need to talk about, and it's Knuckle Puck. Knuckle Puck was one of those bands that was also a little bit more aggressive than the other bands at the time. I think it was mostly the lead singer's voice. It was just a little bit more raw and gritty than some of the clean vocals that pop punk is typically known for. Knuckle Puck is another one of those bands that I definitely recommend checking out their new stuff. I think some of the songs on their last album are some of the best stuff they've ever put out. So again, definitely recommend checking that out. And a quick funny story with Knuckle Puck. I remember I tried to find this tweet, but I couldn't. It always sucks trying to find stuff on Twitter. But I've never felt older than when Knuckle Puck had to phonetically tweet out how to pronounce copacetic. I guess their fans were just, some of them were younger, and I mean, I guess they had to get enough questions at shows or tweets of how to say the title of their new album. But yeah, I remember when that tweet came out, and I have never, ever felt older. 4 Year Strong are definitely one of the pioneers of Easycore. Their songs, Wasting Time, and It Must Suck to Be 4 Year Strong right now were massive songs in the scene. And now in 2024, I think 4 Year Strong are one of the best bands still active from that scene. The only bad album from the band, you already know what I'm going to say, is In Some Way, Shape, or Form. But really besides that, everything they've released has been good or great rock and roll. The self-titled, Brain Pain, those are great rock albums. I really think 4 Year Strong can fill that void of rock music that we're missing in the mainstream. How can I not talk about Turnover? Their album Peripheral Vision is as close as you can get to being a perfect album. Before Peripheral Vision, Turnover had some popularity with songs like Sasha and Most of the Time, but they didn't really stick out in the crowded pop-punk scene, but that all changed with Peripheral Vision. After that album, a bunch of kids realized that shoegaze was a thing and made it their entire personality. I always compare Peripheral Vision to American Football's debut because those albums are so popular and so loved that both bands can't seem to get past them. Right or wrong, both bands are defined by those albums, and that's gotta weigh on you as a creative person, being constantly boxed into something that you did years ago. With all that said, next year will be the 10th anniversary of Peripheral Vision. It'll be interesting to see if the band does anything special for it. Touche Amore's ability to talk about grief and express that with hardcore makes them legends in my book. I think 2016's Stage 4 was the album that cemented the band as legends. It's a beautifully sad and aggressive expression of loss and grief, and it also works as a kind of like a hand on your shoulder helping you through. The Hotel Years album, Home Like No Place There Is, it's kind of similar to Stage 4 as an album that deals with grief. It's probably a more immediately catchier album than Touche Amore, but that doesn't take away any of the personal emotions on the album, and that album is one of the most beloved emo albums of the 2010s. When I tell you that the Pizza Record was everywhere, I mean it was everywhere. Tiger's Jaw used acoustic guitars, melodies, even a little bit of folk punk to stand out. They didn't really sound like any of the other pop punk or emo bands at the time, and the reason people loved the Pizza Record is because it had a little bit of everything. The great punky opener, The Sun, the band's most popular song, Plane, Tank, and Submarine, which is almost kind of like a slow ballad kind of a song before the full band kicks in. I Saw Water, Chemicals, Between Your Band, I Was Never Your Boyfriend, Never Saw It Coming. This album had some of the best pop punk and emo songs of the entire decade. Tiger's Jaw also did something that many other bands can't do, and that's keep going after your lead singer leaves the band. And I don't know if this is a hot take, but I think Spin is just as good as the Pizza Record. Another band that defined the sound of emo in the 2010s was Citizen. Their album Youth took over the scene in 2013. Because it wasn't a pop-punk album, it wasn't really emo either. It was like grungy rock with a little bit of hardcore, a little bit of spoken word. I think you can kind of compare it to La Dispute. I don't know if that completely makes sense. Have I even talked about La Dispute yet? We'll talk about La Dispute in a second. They were also very important. Citizen was just viewed as more mature back in 2013. I don't know if that sounds kind of funny now, but, they didn't sound like the bright bubblegum pop songs of the early 2000s pop punk bands, and they weren't singing about pizza and friends like the Easycore bands, so they were kind of unique in that sense. They weren't intense like Title Fight or Touche Amore or La Dispute, but they weren't as pop as some of the other bands. So they were a lot of people's introduction into harder, more intense music. Citizen is still active today, and I don't know how everyone else feels, but I like the band's new album, Calling the Dogs. If you only have time for one song, I would check out If You're Lonely. I want to dive more into La Dispute because I just think they're such an interesting band. If we're talking about unique bands that don't sound like your typical emo or pop punk band, then yeah, we need to talk about La Dispute. La Dispute's most popular song, which currently has over 38 million streams on Spotify, is 1 minute and 35 seconds. And to this day, when people want to use a emo song on TikTok, Such Small Hands is like one of the top picks. La Dispute mixed spoken word with emo and hardcore to create such a unique sound, and nobody has really done it better. The last few bands I'm going to talk about I consider the big four of punk rock in the 2010s. The first band, the Menzingers. I love the Menzingers. They are my favorite band. I remember coming home straight from school and hearing, I want to say it was the Obituaries. I feel like that was the first song that was premiered, or the first single from On the Impossible Past. It might have been Gates, but for some reason that doesn't sound right. But anyway, I swear the song, I tried to find it and I couldn't prove this. Maybe someone in the comments will remember. I swear the song was premiered on like Hot Topics YouTube channel. Anyway, On the Impossible Past is my favorite album. It might be one of my favorite albums of all time. I had never heard anything like it, and the Menzingers quickly became my favorite band, and they just released great album after great album. And whether you're a On the Impossible Past person or you're a After the Party person, it doesn't matter because both of those albums are not just great punk rock albums, but some of the best rock albums released during the 2010s. Pup is another great punk rock band, and I just can't help but think how different things would be if rock radio wasn't run by idiots, and bands like Pup, the Menzingers, the Wonder Years, The Story So Far were played on every rock station that just plays Smells Like Teen Spirit every 10 minutes. Like how different the entire 2010 scene would have been if there was some mainstream outlet for this great music. The thing that set Pup apart from the other bands in the scene was they were an aggressive band for sure, but they weren't too aggressive. You could sing along to the dark and depressing lyrics, and you could do it with a smile. The first song I ever heard from Joyce Manor was Beach Community, and when it gets to that part in the song where it goes, "Everything reminds me of you," that's it. I was hooked. The bands that still hold up from the 2010s, I think the one thing that all of them have in common is that they were consistent. Every time Joyce Manor has put out new music, I'm always excited to hear it because I know it's always going to be good. And I also think that lead singer Barry Johnson's voice is just distinct enough to stand out. There was always online chatter about Joyce Manor when they were coming up, but really everything changed when Never Hung Over Again was released. Again, it's one of those albums that it's pretty close to a perfect punk rock album. I'm going to put Bomb the Music Industry and Jeff Rosenstock together for pretty obvious reasons. They share a lot of band members if you don't know. So Bomb the Music Industry, Jeff Rosenstock, very important in the 2010s. I remember reading online that there was this punk band that was putting up all their songs for free, all their albums for free. And I remember being in high school and thinking, that's the coolest, punkest thing I have ever heard. My introduction to Bomb the Music Industry was the Adults EP, so I think I got really lucky because everyone loves that EP. It's so good. Every song on it is great. Jeff Rosenstock is a punk rock legend in every sense of the word. So is Bomb the Music Industry. If you've never had the chance to check out Jeff Rosenstock or Bomb the Music Industry, do it. You're not going to be upset. You're going to listen to some of the best punk rock, some of the best ska of all time, really, in my opinion. I think Jeff Rosenstock and Bomb the Music Industry have released some of the best punk rock, some of the best ska of all time. I think I covered all the important bands in the 2010s, but I know somebody's going to leave a comment saying, Michael, you forgot this band. So before you leave that comment, why don't you just scroll up a little bit? If you could hit that like button, I'd appreciate it. Doesn't need to be a big like, just a little like, just a nice little like. And since you're already there, why not hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed? And if you did both of those two things, go ahead and leave that comment. Thanks. Before moving on, I want to give a shout out to the F Yeah Pop Punk blog. It was a music blog at the time, but the important thing they did, at least for me, was they released mixtapes of all the up-and-coming pop punk bands at the time. Mixtapes meaning a media fire RAR zip file with like 15 to 20 bands. So many bands I discovered from that mixtape, from those mixtapes, which I'm going to talk about all those bands very shortly. But I wanted to give a quick shout out to Devin because I don't know where my music fandom journey would have went had I not ever found those mixtapes. I want to talk about what made the 2010 scene so different from the early 2000s boom period. I think during that time, the pop punk bands were marketed as boy bands. They were marketed as fun, upbeat, simple, bubblegum pop songs for teenagers. And some of that stuff has held up. Some of that stuff is fun to go back to listen to be nostalgic for. But, let's be honest with each other. The 2010 scene, to put it really simply, I think was just a little bit more mature than the early 2000s. And don't get me wrong, there was plenty of cringy stuff in the 2010s as well. But I think overall, a lot of the music that we still remember, the bands that we still talk about, the albums that have held up from the 2010s, a lot of that music wasn't boxed into the pop punk formula that was just everywhere in the early 2000s. What defined the 2010s emo and pop punk revival? A lot of people say it was defend pop punk. A lot of people say it was pizza, hating your hometown, songs about hanging out with your friends, songs about anchors. Like a lot of songs about anchors. An obscene amount of songs about anchors. But to me, one of the biggest underrated factors of the 2010s emo and pop punk revival was social media. During the 2010s, we saw the rise of social media, which meant it was easier for bands to get their music out in the world. It was easier for bands to connect with their fans. It was easier to discover music. It was easier to discover different types of music because there were Facebook groups, Twitter, Tumblr, forums, and a bunch of different blogs and websites that were covering emo and pop punk. The biggest one, without question, was Property of Zack. I'm pretty sure I checked Property of Zack daily to get my news from around the scene, who's touring, who just put out a new song, what's everyone saying about this new song or this new album. If you were a band in the early 2010s, you wanted Property of Zack to write an article or post about your new song. I also have to give a shout out to the Defend Pop Punk group on Facebook. If you know, you know. I don't think you can understate the importance of social media to the scene at the time. It completely eliminated distance from this worldwide revival. If you were a fan of a band and they were on the complete other side of the planet, it didn't matter. You could instantly connect with them, really, for the first time. In those primordial years of social media, everyone was kind of figuring out what to do. No one knew what this new fancy thing called social media was. We weren't that far from MySpace and Pure Volume, but we weren't yet into the Spotify, TikTok, influencer type of social media that we have today. As a young fan of punk rock, I always heard these stories of, the early Washington, D.C. hardcore scene where emo was coming out of. You had Minor Threat, you had Black Flag, you had all these bands of this chaotic underground punk rock scene that you had to be there to experience it. But with social media, that all changed. Using myself as an example, I could live in Chicago and then get updates from my favorite band who is in, the UK or Australia, and I could see photos and videos of the entire show that they played minutes or after that it finished on the other side of the planet. And that's why I think the 2010 scene just felt so connected, because it literally was. And it was also interesting to see how bands at the time worked social media into their songs, because obviously you write about what you experience, and we were all experiencing social media for the first time. We were all looking at our crush's Instagram to see what they were up to, or trying to interpret this vague Facebook status and try to figure out if it was about us. Social media was one of the defining aspects of the entire 2010s revival, simply because it wasn't a part of any previous era of punk rock, pop punk, and emo. Social media bridged the geographical gap between bands and fans got to experience the entire punk rock scene in real time. Social media shaped the entire culture and music of the decade. Remember when vinyl used to be cheap? Every time I see a major artist like Taylor Swift or Beyonce promoting their new album with different vinyl variants, I always think, I wonder if anyone knows that punk bands deserve the credit for keeping vinyl alive. During the 2010s, when streaming music was really just starting to take over, physical music sales obviously went down, but that didn't stop punk bands from pressing everything they could on vinyl. I mean, we had 7 inches, 12 inches, 10 inches, picture discs, flexi discs, 180-gram vinyl, colored vinyl, EPs were pressed on vinyl, singles were pressed on vinyl, B-sides, splits, demos, anything that could be pressed on vinyl was. I'm not saying pop punk and emo are solely responsible for keeping vinyl alive, but rock music is. Just look at the data. I wasn't able to find a graph that talked about subgenre sales, but all the data shows that rock music is the top-selling genre of vinyl. Also, if you didn't know, CD sales and cassette sales are all going up. I'm not exactly sure what that means for music, but it is nice to know that people still care about physical media. Can you imagine if streaming just, poof, went away tomorrow? I wonder how many people would even know what to do with MP3 files and moving them over to their phone to listen to music. And even with CDs, like, okay, give me a CD. Most people don't have CD players in their cars anymore. Most people don't have a CD player in their house. It's not in their computer. It's not in their laptop. You would probably, the company that makes those, CD external drives, their stock would go up, but that's probably about it. So I don't know what the solution is here with music as opposed to, if we're excluding streaming music. I know CD sales and cassette sales are up, and hey, that's awesome. I love physical media, don't get me wrong, but for the majority of people, I think it's streaming music or there'd be a lot of chaos. But I do have to admit, I do miss my iPod. So I think everyone has a special place for the local bands in your scene that you see when you're young and you're first getting into music, and for whatever reason, these bands never get bigger than their local scene. They're never, a mainstream name if you're, a big fan of pop punk, emo, or punk rock. So I wanted to talk about some of my favorite bands from the Chicago pop punk scene. Don't worry, I'll keep it really brief because I know there's a good chance that none of you have ever even heard of these bands. Before Real Friends and Knuckle Puck put the Chicago scene on the map in the 2010s, So Many Ways and 3 Cent Cinema were waving the pop punk flag. So Many Ways eventually became more of a rock band, kinda like 4 Years Strong are now, but with their 2013 EP, So Many Ways was basically a thrash pop punk band. Think of pop punk with guitar solos. Man, So Many Ways really should have taken over the scene. So Many Ways also had an Easycore song about Twilight that really should have been in the soundtrack to at least one of the movies. So Many Ways, I just think they were a very, very underrated band. Colin, if you're watching this, I hope everything's going well. 3 Cent Cinema started out as a Easycore band, but then they kind of morphed into a more traditional pop punk band. But I always thought that the best stuff they ever put out was on the This Is What I Wanted EP. The memory is coming back to me right now of leaving school on a Friday and going to see 3 Cent Cinema play at the Box Social in Chicago, which was a part of like the Congress Theater Complex. Yeah, that all sounds about right. But 3 Cent Cinema were an important band because one of their members or somebody from the band went to the same high school, but they were like, a few years like when I was a freshman, they were a senior. It was something like that. So I remember being, we were all, me and my friends, we were all like, well, wow, we get to go see someone in a band who was in our high school. Wow, blew our minds. The other bands I'm going to give a shout out to are Chase the City, Knockout Kid, Plastic Smiles, Kitty Hawk, all great bands that for whatever reason just never really grew past our local scene here in Chicago, but all great bands, and I definitely recommend you check them out. Isn't it kind of weird that for some of those bands in the early 2010s, a lot of their music is just basically lost media? Like, because you were before the LimeWire, no, you were after LimeWire, but you were before Spotify, and before Bandcamp, right? Yeah. So SoundCloud, I remember a lot of songs being on, but if you don't have your MP3 files from your band that you were in the early 2010s, you're not on streaming anywhere, most likely, right? So you're just, you basically don't exist if you're not on streaming, right? Like, a lot of those bands are probably lost in the internet void. I covered all the important bands that left a major impact on the 2010s scene, but there's so many other bands I want to talk about, so I'm going to do a quick speed run of some underrated bands from the 2010s. If you ever wanted to hear a more pop-punk version of Latterman, the Crucial Dudes had you covered. Everyone always talks about the 61 Pen album, which is good, but I really liked the Crucial Dudes' His Day Has Come split. I think those are the best songs the band ever had. I always regretted not seeing them live. I Call Five's self-titled album from 2012 was a great pop-punk record. Think like The Academy Is, The Starting Line, that type of pop-punk. If this album came out like 5 years earlier, I honestly think that I Call Fives would have been a mainstream band. I debated putting Transit in the underrated bands category because I think they did have an impact on the entire scene, but I really never see people talking about Transit when they talk about the 2010s, so I'm going to put them here, but I think Transit holds up. I remember a lot of people didn't like their last album, Joyride, when it came out, and I'm really not sure why. Maybe people still wanted the fun pizza type of pop punk and Transit just matured too fast. Transit also had Patrick Stump from Fall Out Boy on a song. They really should have been bigger. Speaking of bands that should have been bigger, A Loss for Words had catchy songs, a great singer. I mean, they released an entire album of Motown covers as pop punk songs. How could you not like A Loss for Words? Such Gold was too hardcore for the pop punk kids and too pop punk for the hardcore kids. Forever Came Calling was such a great band. All of their albums were good. If you haven't checked them out, go listen to Front Porch Sunrise and you're going to find your new favorite band. With Handguns, their EP Don't Bite Your Tongue really put them on the map. It was everywhere. Handguns were always a weird band because I think by the end, the band had like no original members left. Martha's Blister in the Pit of My Heart is one of the best emo/pop-punk albums of the 2010s, and I have no idea why the scene hasn't embraced it. I love Chumped. I've talked about them a ton on the channel, and I was trying to figure out why Chumped was such an impactful band for me at that time, and I think it was just Chumped had the songs that I needed to hear at that time in my life. Union Square is one of the songs that comes to mind immediately. The lyrics in that song are about kind of standing on the morning train, you know, where most people are on their way to work, and, you know, we're kind of all in this together because we all probably don't want to go to work. We want a better job. Or for me, I was going to college at the time when I at least first heard that song, and I was taking the Blue Line here in Chicago downtown to college, a college I didn't want to go to. College that I didn't want to be at, that was, in my opinion, I felt at the time, you know, wasting my time and more importantly, wasting my money, all those student loans. And I remember just listening to that song when, you know, it would come on, and it just, you know, it was the song that I needed to hear at the time. And yeah, that's why I love Jumped. After Chumped broke up, lead singer Anika Pyle was also in Katie Ellen. This is also an awesome record. Definitely recommend it. I never got to see Chumped live during the 2010s, so if anybody from Chumped is watching and you guys are thinking about playing another show, I would suggest Chicago. The Swellers were a skate punk band, then they made a mainstream rock album, then they made an emo album that was basically Pinkerton 2.0 but better. So I was at the Swellers' last show here in Chicago. It was at the Sub T, and during their first song in their last set, again, the last set, I believe Sleeper was the first song, my friend who's standing right next to me starts coughing up blood. So of course we take him outside, call an ambulance, and we spend the night in the hospital. Don't worry. He's okay. He was okay, and he is okay now. But yeah, all of that to say, Swellers, if you're watching and you want to play one more Chicago show, I know a few people who would appreciate it and like to be there. These are the last few bands. Major League, their 2012 album Hard Feelings was a great pop-punk album. I would check out Homewrecker, Fireworks, so many catchy songs, so many good albums. This time next year, their album Drop Out of Life is a great pop-punk album. I don't understand why it never caught on. Seaway. A lot of people, I feel like when they talk about Seaway, talk about like their early stuff, but I swear, their 2020 album, Big Vibe, was the best album that the band ever made, and not enough people talk about it. Mixtapes, catchy songs, I love the dual vocals. Mixtapes was a band that always reminded us that even on the worst nights, it tends to be alright. Polar Bear Club, a great rock band. Everybody always talks about the singer's voice changing on their last album, Death Chorus, but it's not like the singer had any control over that. From what I remember happening at the time, it was just kind of a thing that happened with his vocal cords. So I never liked how the scene reacted to that whole thing. And not to mention that Death Chorus was a pretty good album anyway. So Polar Bear Club, if you're out there, just know, we love you. Misser. What a great band. Great songs, great lyrics. What was the song? I really want the world to end. No, I'm really starting to think that the world should end in 2012. I think that was the title of that song. That was a great song. Bad News. Sick. Then the Distancing EP. Salad Days. Infrared. Die Alone. I'm missing 2 songs, but I think that was pretty impressive. And then Hostage Calm. Hostage Calm was like the punk band that you could bring home to mom. It was punk rock, but with just enough classic rock. It was a little bit more catchy than like your Menzingers or Gaslight Anthem. If you've never listened to Hostage Calm, go listen to the full band version of their song, The M Word. Not the acoustic version, the full band version that was on some compilation album that I will put up somewhere here. The full band version, and then I think you're going to fall in love with Hostage Calm. The 2010s was a time for a lot of change in the punk scene. It was the last few years of the Warped Tour. Streaming music was now really becoming a thing. There was no MTV, there was no radio, there was no mainstream outlet for all of this great music. And even with all of that, it was such a unique time in the scene with such a passionate fan base. So many people were writing blogs, doing their own interviews, making YouTube videos, doing their own radio shows. It was like everything that I heard about for the early days of punk rock. Just a bunch of kids who didn't know what they were doing. They just did it, and they did it themselves. It felt like the entire revival was ours, like it was this big secret club that the mainstream wasn't invited to. I mean, I was in Chicago, so I was lucky enough to be a part of a, Chicago, even before the 2010s, obviously, is a legendary scene for punk rock, pop punk, emo, and all of that stuff. But specific to me, I went to a pretty big high school in Chicago, and even with that, there were only like 4, 5, maybe 6 of us who had any idea of this entire revival happening, who were talking about bands like The Story So Far and The Wonder Years and going to see them when they came to Chicago to play shows on the weekend. And from what I remember, a lot of those shows had a bunch of people. Again, I just happened to be lucky enough to be, in Chicago during this time, so that might have been a little bit of an outlier. But from everything that I saw online, it just felt like this worldwide revival was so small because we had social media to connect us all, so it felt like this entire revival was ours. Bands were no longer afraid to call themselves emo or pop punk. They actually embraced it. And a cool little side effect of what happened in the 2010 scene was that there was a appreciation for a lot of the older bands that came before, because, without the 2010s, I don't know if we get a American football reunion. I don't know if we get 2 brand new American football albums. Sunny Day Real Estate reunited. We also got recently just a new song from Sunny Day Real Estate. I don't know if any of that happens without the renewed appreciation and respect for all the bands that came before, well before the 2010s, but everyone was on social media. We were all talking about, all the modern music that was happening at the time, but also those bands were talking about who influenced them. And then if you didn't know about American football, The Promise Ring, or Sunny Day Real Estate, you can now, for the most part, for the first time, easily go look up and check out and hear music from these bands that, for the most part, were smaller bands that weren't, they weren't mainstream popular bands in the 90s when they all, were doing their thing and releasing music. So for the first time, a nice little cool thing that happened, besides all the great music that was coming out from younger bands in the 2010s, was this renewed appreciation for emo history, for pop punk history, and for punk rock history. I always heard about the early days of punk rock, but I was never there. I didn't get to experience it. But I did see the Wonder Years in 2011. I saw The Story So Far in 2011. I saw Title Fight in 2012. I saw Man Overboard defend pop punk. I listened to about 100 songs about anchors. I got to see Bomb the Music Industry in 2014. I've been thinking about doing this video for a long time because I wanted to show my appreciation to all those bands that helped me. They helped me with breakups, with graduating high school, starting college, helped with grief and dealing with anger and just growing up in general. And I think sometimes we don't give people their flowers before it's too late, and I wanted to make this video to be just a big thank you to all the bands that I mentioned, the bands that you've probably heard of from the 2010s, or maybe you're discovering some of the newer bands I talked about in the underrated section, or maybe you didn't hear about some of the bands that I think are a major factor in the 2010s scene, and that's fine as well. The whole point of this channel has always been to help people find new music, and maybe you'll find your new favorite band. But I always wanted to make this video, and I always wanted it to not be like a brief overview because I was there, so I wanted to make it as nerdy as possible. So for anybody else that was in high school and in college at that time, was the same age as me during the 2010s, that kind of had, I would assume, a shared experience like I talked about in this video. So I just wanted this to be a big thank you to all the bands that I talked about and all the bands that I probably forgot about. And that's the video. Those are all my thoughts on the 2010s emo and pop punk revival. I hope you liked the video. I'll be down in the comments continuing the conversation. Please like the video. Please subscribe if you haven't. Stay posy. Tell all your friends. And as always, thanks for watching.